I have been asked to speak to you about how we in Finland perceive the future of education over the next 10 years and about what education policy should address to keep pace with the rapid technological and social change. First, it is good to keep in mind that 10 years is a mere blink of an eye when it comes to education policy. In 2019, we decided to expand compulsory education in Finland by 2 years to the age 18. The reform was implemented rapidly and came into force in 2021, bringing the first 2 years of secondary education within compulsory education. Now, the first signs are very good, as the number of dropouts under the age of 18 has decreased. But the real results will of course be visible only later. The first affected cohorts will turn 18 next year and will have to wait until 2024 to see how many will actually graduate. And it will not be until 2030 that the full effect will be visible in the 20 to 25-year-old age group. We know that any changes in curricula take time to be prepared, and the first signs of their impact usually take some 7 years to be visible in educational outcomes. So if we were to kick off an ambitious curriculum reform today, it would likely be premature to assess the full effects of the policy even in 10 years' time. Thus, any discussion on the next decade focuses on the immediate policy choices, what we must do here and now. The aims and objectives of the policy are much more distant. Because of the time it takes for anything we do to have an effect, our aims are long-term aims. Thus, today's policy must combine anticipation of change over the long term with an understanding of effective policy in the short term. The future, as we are so often reminded, is uncertain. During the last few years, this has been particularly obvious. The pandemic, war, energy crisis, each of these disruptions is a perfect example of a crisis we could have anticipated. The risk of a pandemic was known beforehand, and we have had some very close calls during the last 20 years. Many in the audience are well aware that geopolitics and the risk of war never went away, even in Europe, despite people sometimes forgetting it. So anticipating the future is often entirely possible. Timing and details are difficult, but the general outline can be perceived. Very often the saying, the more it changes, the more it is the same, applies. And thus, both the future we prepare for and the means we use to ready ourselves heavily draw upon our understanding of the currents of history, typically guided by technological development. For millennia, humankind was caught in a Malthusian subsistence trap, where technological development led to increasing population and the living standards did not rise. But over the last centuries, that trap has finally been broken. It was broken by technology and education. Technological development increased the returns of skills and competences and made human capital more valuable, changed the way families operate and behave. Suddenly, it was no longer wise to have as many children as possible, and instead having fewer and educating them better started to make more sense. The focus shifted from quantity to quality. The slow breaking of this trap still continues on the global level. It is quite far in parts of Asia, less so in Africa. In developed countries around the world, we are now experiencing a phase where the number of retirees and the elderly is increasing quite sharply, and the size of the working age population is shrinking. This change makes it necessary for us to renegotiate the social contract in many countries, where education and care for the elderly have been publicly funded. Our solution is to raise the education level of the population. We know that education level is more significant than fertility in determining how we are able to take care of the aging population. In Finland, projections tell us that if we were able to achieve our objective of giving tertiary education to half of all 25 to 34-year-olds by 2030, we would almost eliminate the deterioration of productivity weighted old age dependency ratio for several decades. In essence, if we can make more efficient use of our population by giving them the necessary skills for tomorrow, we can afford to take care of everyone. We can manage better when we leave no one behind. This is the very same mechanism that has transformed the world during the last centuries. We have fewer children, but we take care of them better, so that technological development leads to rising living standards. And just as before, this development can also be a force for the good, in that it enables and requires advances in social equality. The more our progress depends on using the individual potential of everyone to the fullest, the less we can afford to let some fall behind due to their gender, their ethnicity, or their social background. Thus, the last centuries have not only been a slow progress away from the subsistence trap, they've also been a slow progress of equality of opportunity for all. Now, we are not in the end yet, but the steps to take are clear. More education, better education, more equal education. So that we do not fall short of the requirements of the future, and so that we do not waste individual talent. The challenge, of course, is that the economic resources available for the public sector have been scarce for a long time, and the situation does not seem to be getting easier. In Finland, we patiently increased our investments in education for a very long time. Between the 1960s and the early 1990s, we rose from international mediocrity to having the young adults with the highest educational achievements in the OECD. But that rising path of investment came to an end during the depression of the 1990s. Since then, the investment in education has been on a slowly declining path, which is partially responsible for the long stagnation of our education level to levels below the OECD average. Now, the mood has changed, and there is increasing national recognition of the growing need for more education. The common challenge in European fiscal policy with our aging populations is that investment expenditures are often disproportionately targeted. Investment is easy to overlook and deprioritize because the harmful effects are only visible in the long term. Thus, the danger is that even if education were the means by which we can achieve sustainable dependency ratios, we end up in an unfruitful competition for resources between education, which is needed for the future, and health and social expenditure, which are needed now by the aging population. So I urge us all to remember this. Education is expensive, but not half as expensive as is ignorance. The third crucial issue I'd like to raise, besides more education and more equal education, is the flexibility of education. Education, which was traditionally reserved for upper social groups, has slowly and progressively become equally available to the whole population. This equalization of access is also related to content of education. In the past, it was thought that only a small part of the population should be generating culture and guiding society, while the great masses could take part in culture but not create it. They could be part of the functioning society, but their role would be more one of execution than deliberation and decision-making. In the 1800s, many asked, why would a farm laborer need to learn to read and write? Later, the question was, why would a blue-collar worker need to learn foreign languages? Even more recently, it wasn't uncommon to hear comments suggesting that general subject matters should be cut from vocational education to focus more on job skills. The need for citizenship education was especially questioned. Why should we spend time and resources on something that does not directly serve the individual in the labor market? Now, when we look at the recent events in Europe, the war in Ukraine, the rise of authoritarianism across the world, it is increasingly clear that we do need to provide strong citizenship education for everyone. It is not an optional extra, a bonus that is nice to have, It is necessary for our survival. New technologies have brought new challenges for democracy, but they also allow us to defend democracy in entirely new ways. And I think this is the guiding principle when we choose the steps to take education ready for the future. We need everyone more than ever. Not only to work or to take care of the old and the young, but also to defend and renew democracy. Democracy cannot be preserved or conserved. It must be relived and reconstructed every day. And for that, we need everyone.